The night was silent in the far side of the galaxy, where a peaceful human colony floated between stars. The world had wide fields and strong cities, but now it was under great danger. Strange dark ships moved above the skies. Their weapons struck at towers and homes, leaving flames and broken walls. The colony people sent calls for help to every corner of space. They sent messages again and again, with only one hope: that someone would hear them and come to save them far away in a place where few could live stood. The Death World, a land of storms and mountains of endless ice. A place where rivers could crush stone and the air could cut like a blade. The humans who lived there were called Deathworlders. They were strong and feared across space. They had survived where no one else could, and they fought with skill no other people had. One night in the Death World, a message reached the Hall of the Fighters. The voice in the message was shaking with fear. The words spoke of fire and death, of families running and of homes falling. A voice cried out for help. The sound filled the room. Jack Hunter stood in the corner. He was tall, with hard eyes and broad shoulders. He had fought in many battles. His hands were rough from years of holding steel. Claire Mason stood beside him. She had a sharp mind and a way of thinking that could turn a battle with only a plan and a few strong moves. She was not a fighter of the front lines, but her mind was the weapon that had won many wars. The hall grew quiet. All eyes turned to Jack. He listened to the full message, then looked at Claire. They both knew this call could not be ignored. The colony was far, but the danger was great. If the Deathworlders did not act, the people there would be gone in days. Jack spoke with a steady voice. He said that the Deathworlders would go. He said they would fight for the people and bring them back their home. Claire nodded and said she would lead the plan. She would watch every step and guide them through the worst of the fight. The next morning, the fighters gathered. They carried their gear and weapons. Each one was ready to face whatever was waiting in the far colony. The ship they would take was not new. It was an old warship built for hard travel. Its walls were marked by old battles, and its engines gave deep rumble. But it was strong, and it could survive the trip through dangerous space. They set off. The stars passed by in streams of light. The journey was long, and the way was not safe. They crossed places where great rocks floated in the dark. Crashing into each other with deadly force, they passed through regions where law did not reach. Where ships of raiders watched from the shadows, but did not dare to attack. The sight of the warship and the mark of the Deathworlders kept them away. On the ship, the fighters trained every day. Jack led them in the training hall, showing them moves for close combat. Told them to strike fast, to move without fear, to watch each other and never fight alone. Claire spent her time in the command room. She studied old records of battles fought in that sector. She read reports of missing ships and broken cities. She began to see signs in the way. The attacks were made. She guessed that the enemy was not only using weapons. They were also trying to break the spirit of the colony by cutting off food and water, by making the people lose faith in their leaders. The fighters grew sharper and ready. The old warship moved faster toward the call for help. The closer they came, the more they could feel the weight of the fight ahead. Jack walked the halls of the ship at night, thinking of the faces of the people they would save. Claire worked late over maps and screens, marking places where they would strike first. Then one day, the colony appeared in the view screen. It was a bright world of green and blue, but the sight was filled with smoke. Whole cities burned, fires spread across fields, the waters were dark with ash. Jack stood looking at the sight, his jaw tight. Claire came beside him and said they had to move fast. The people below would not last much longer. The ship descended through the smoke. The air was thick and filled with the smell of burning. The landing field was broken and blackened, but still the warship touched down. Fighters poured out, moving in lines. The people of the colony came running to meet them. Their faces showed both fear and hope. They had seen the mark of the Deathworlders and knew that help had come. Jack met the leader of the colony at the base of the main tower. The leader was the human queen, Elizabeth Hart. She stood tall, though the lines of worry were clear on her face. She welcomed Jack and Claire as if she had known them for years. She spoke of the danger and the attacks. She told them of the parts of the colony already lost. She said that the enemy had taken the main resource hubs, and now the city had no food or power. Jack listened without a word. When she was done, he said the Deathworlders would not fail. They would take back the hubs and drive the enemy away. Claire added that they would move in the night, using the streets as cover. She said that if they struck fast and in the right place, the enemy would break. That night, as the fires burned in the distance, Jack walked among the fighters. He told them the plan. He told them they would fight as one, and no one would stand alone. Claire stayed in the command post, ready to guide them step by step. The fighters checked their weapons and moved into the streets. Shadows covered their path. The sound of their boots was the only sign of their coming. The night was quiet, but the air was heavy. Every fighter knew that the battle was near. They moved toward the first resource hub, ready to strike, and ready to show why the Deathworlders were feared above all others. The streets were silent as the fighters moved deeper into the city. The smoke from burning buildings drifted through the air. The moonlight shone on broken walls and empty roads. Jack led the first line. His eyes moved over every shadow and doorway. Claire stayed in the command post, watching their signals on the screen. Her voice came through the headsets, telling them where to turn and when to stop. She had studied the map for hours and knew each alley and corner. The first resource hub stood beyond a set of heavy gates. The building was tall and made of thick steel. Its windows were covered with plates, and the doors were locked from the inside. Jack signaled to the fighters. They took positions around the gates, waiting for his order. The night air was still, but the sound of movement came from within. Jack raised his arm, and the fighters pushed forward. The gates fell with a loud crash, and the fighters rushed in. And inside the hub, the enemy was ready. They had taken high ground and placed heavy weapons in the corners. The first shots rang out as the fighters took cover. Jack moved quickly through the open floor, striking hard with his blade. His movements were sharp, and every strike found its mark. The fighters followed his lead, pushing forward step by step. Claire guided them from her post. She told them where the weak points were, and where the enemy fire was thin. Her voice was calm and clear. Even in the middle of the battle, she sounded certain. Jack trusted her words and adjusted the attack with each message. Soon they reached the control room of the hub. The fight there was close and fast. The enemy used every trick to hold their ground, but the fighters pressed harder. Jack struck the last guard, and the room fell silent. Claire told them to secure the control panels and restart the power lines. Within minutes, lights began to glow across the district. Outside, the people of the colony saw the light return, and hope filled their hearts. The fighters regrouped in the street. Jack checked each one, making sure they were ready for the next move. They had taken the first hub, but the work was not over. The Queen sent word that the enemy had tightened their hold on the second hub. This one was in the old part of the city where narrow streets and tall buildings made movement hard. Claire warned them that this would be a harder fight than the first. They moved at once, crossing through the ruined blocks. The sound of distant fire echoed in the night. Jack led them through a narrow passage that opened into a square. The second hub stood at the far end, guarded by high walls and a network of barricades. The fighters spread out, using the shadows to hide their approach. Jack gave the signal, and they moved in from three sides. The enemy responded with a sudden burst of fire, forcing the fighters to take cover. The walls were too strong for a direct push. So, Jack called for a split attack. Half the fighters kept the enemy busy, while the other half scaled the side wall and dropped into the courtyard. The surprise broke the defense, and the fighters swept through the hub in minutes. Claire sent new orders to seal the gates and lock the streets around the area. Soon the hub was secure, and supplies began to flow again. But the victory brought new danger. Reports came in that the enemy was gathering in the southern sector, preparing for a large strike. The Queen sent word for Jack to return to the main tower for a meeting. Jack left a small guard at each hub and made his way to the tower. Claire joined him, bringing maps and reports inside the hall. The Queen stood with her council. Her face was calm, but her voice was firm. She told them the enemy was planning to cut the city in half. If they succeeded, the northern sector would be lost. Jack studied the map. The enemy would likely strike along the main road where most of the defenses had already fallen. He said the only way to stop them was to meet them before they reached the city center. Claire agreed, and added that they could use the narrow southern bridge to trap them. The bridge was old, and only wide enough for a few fighters at a time. If they could hold it, the enemy would have to turn back. The plan was set. The fighters left the tower and moved toward the southern sector. The night was cold, and the wind carried the smell of smoke. The streets grew darker as they moved away from the lights of the hubs. Jack kept his eyes forward, knowing the enemy could be waiting in any shadow. Claire kept speaking through the headset, guiding them closer to the bridge. When they reached the bridge, they found it empty. Jack ordered the fighters to take positions along the stone walls. Soon the sound of marching feet filled the air. The enemy came in numbers carrying weapons and shields. The first wave rushed forward, but the narrow bridge slowed them. Jack stood in the front line, striking with fierce power. The fighters beside him held firm, using every skill they had learned on the Death World. The fight lasted until the first light of dawn. The ground was marked with the signs of battle. The last enemy fell, and the bridge was secure. Jack looked across the river and saw no more movement. The southern sector was safe for now. Claire told him they had bought time, but the enemy would return, stronger. The fighters returned to the city as the sun rose. The people lined the streets, cheering and calling out to them. The Queen met them at the tower and thanked them for their courage. Jack said they would not rest until the colony was free. Claire stood beside him, already thinking of the next move. That night, the fires in the city were smaller. The lights from the hubs shone brighter. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. The enemy was still out there gathering strength, and the real battle was yet to come. The day after the battle at the bridge, the city was quiet. The fighters used the time to repair weapons and tend to their wounds. Jack walked among them, speaking in short, steady words. He told them to be ready for the next fight. Claire stayed in the command post, reading every report that came in. She marked the enemy movements on a large map and studied the paths they might take next. By noon, a runner from the Queen arrived with urgent news. The enemy had built a camp outside the eastern gates, from where they were sending small groups to strike at the outer homes and farms. The Queen called for Jack and Claire to come to the main tower. When they arrived, the Queen was waiting with her council. She wore a plain cloak, but her presence was strong. She told them the attacks on the east had to stop before the farms were lost. The colony could not survive without the food from those lands. Jack agreed at once. He said the Deathworlders would clear the camp. Before nightfall, Claire opened her map and showed a route that would take them through the old forest to the rear of the enemy camp. The trees would hide their approach, and they could strike before the enemy knew they were there. The Queen gave her blessing and wished them victory. The fighters left the city in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the road. They entered the old forest, where the air was cool and the ground soft with fallen leaves. Jack moved in the lead, his eyes scanning the path. Claire walked behind him, checking her compass and map. The forest was silent, except for the sound of boots and the rustle of branches. After hours of moving through the woods, they reached a hill from which they could see the enemy camp. Below them, fires burned, and tents stood in rows. Armed guards walked the paths between them. Jack studied the scene and pointed to a weak spot on the far side, where fewer guards were posted. Claire whispered the order to move. The fighters spread out and began their descent into the camp. They struck just after nightfall. The first guards fell before they could sound an alarm. The fighters moved swiftly from tent to tent, cutting the enemy lines and breaking their weapons. Jack led them to the largest tent, where the enemy leaders sat around a table. The fight there was short. Jack's blade struck true, and the leaders were taken down. The rest of the enemy scattered into the night, leaving the camp to the fighters. By the time the moon rose high, the camp was in ruins. Supplies were gathered and loaded onto carts to take back to the city. Jack ordered the fires put out, so the enemy would see only darkness when they looked back. Claire walked through the camp, making sure every path was clear. She told Jack the mission was complete, and they could return.
Oh.
The march back to the city was quiet. The fighters moved with steady steps, their shadows long under the moonlight at the gates. The Queen herself waited to greet them. She thanked Jack and Claire and praised the fighters for their courage. The supplies from the camp would keep the colony fed for many weeks. The next day brought darker news. Scouts reported that the enemy was building a stronghold in the northern hills. This place was high and easy to defend. If it was completed, the enemy could strike at the city at will. Jack knew they could not allow it to stand. Claire studied the hills on her map. She said the only way to take the stronghold was to attack before its walls were finished. That night, Jack gathered the fighters again. He told them they would move before dawn. They carried only what they needed and left the city in silence. The march to the hills was long and cold. The path grew steep and the air thin, but the fighters pressed on, guided by the light of the stars. When they reached the edge of the hills, they could see the shape of the stronghold rising against the sky. Wooden towers stood at each corner, and a wall of stone was half built. Fires burned in the center, where workers and guards moved about. Jack pointed to a narrow path that led to the rear gate. Claire nodded and gave the signal. The fighters crept along the path using the rocks as cover they struck at first light. The guards at the rear gate fell quickly, and the fighters poured into the stronghold. The workers fled as the sound of battle filled the air. Jack led the charge through the unfinished walls, breaking the defense before it could form. Claire stayed outside, directing fighters to block every escape route. Within an hour, the stronghold was taken, the unfinished walls were pulled down, and the towers set ablaze. Smoke rose into the morning sky as the fighters began the journey back to the city. They had stopped the enemy from gaining the high ground, and the northern sector was safe for now. When they returned, the people of the colony lined the streets to cheer them. The Queen met them once again at the tower. She spoke of their bravery and said the city had hope because of their strength. Jack stood beside Claire, knowing the fight was far from over. The enemy had been pushed back, but they were not defeated. The next strike could come at any moment, and when it did, the Deathworlders would be ready. The days after the fall of the stronghold were restless. The fighters stayed ready, knowing the enemy would not remain silent for long. Scouts moved beyond the hills, searching for signs of movement. Jack met with Claire every morning in the command post. They studied maps and marked every report that came in. The Queen visited often to hear their plans. Her voice was firm and her eyes showed. She understood the danger. One morning, a scout arrived in haste, reported that the enemy had gathered in the western plains in greater numbers than before. They were building siege engines and large barricades. The Queen called for Jack and Claire at once. In the council hall, she explained that if the enemy crossed the plains, they would reach the outer walls in a single day. Jack said they could not allow the siege engines to be completed. Claire suggested they strike at night and burn the machines before they could be moved. The plan was set. The fighters prepared in silence. Each one checked weapons and armor. Jack gave short orders as they readied for the march. Claire carried the map marked with the fastest route to the plains. They left the city as the sun began to fall. The road to the plains was open and wide, but Jack led them along a side path that kept them hidden among the trees. By nightfall, they reached a ridge overlooking the enemy campfires burned across the field. Siege engines stood in rows surrounded by guards. The fighters lay low as Claire pointed to the weakest point in the enemy line. Jack nodded and gave the order to move. They slipped down the ridge like shadows. Each fighter knew their task and moved without hesitation. They reached the edge of the camp and struck in silence. The first guards fell quickly. The fighters spread out, setting fire to the siege engines. The dry wood caught the flames fast, and soon the air was thick with smoke. The enemy rushed to put out the fires, but Jack and his fighters held them back. Claire guided them through the chaos, making sure no machine was left standing. The battle was fierce. The enemy pushed hard to save their weapons, but the fighters would not give ground. Jack fought at the center, cutting through their lines. His voice carried over the noise, calling his fighters forward. The flames grew higher until the siege engines were nothing but burning frames. At last, the enemy began to fall back, leaving the field to the Deathworlders. When the last of the fires died down, Jack gathered the fighters. They moved quickly back toward the city, knowing the enemy would soon regroup. The march home was long, but the stars above gave them light. At the gates, the Queen met them. She listened as Jack told her the siege engines were destroyed. She thanked each fighter by name and promised the city would remember their courage. The next day, the enemy began to move again, but this time, their attacks were smaller and scattered. Claire warned that this could be a trick to draw the fighters away from the city. Jack agreed and kept most of the fighters close to the walls. Only small groups were sent out to guard the nearby villages. This watch continued for several days, and though the enemy probed the defenses, they found no weakness. Then came word from a runner that the enemy had taken control of the water station in the southern fields. Without the station, the city would run dry within a week. The Queen summoned Jack and Claire to the tower. She said, "The station must be taken back at once." Jack knew the station well. It was built beside a deep river with only one road leading to it. Claire planned to block the road from both sides, trapping the enemy inside. Before dawn, the fighters set out. The air was cool and the grass wet with dew. They reached the road as the sun began to rise. Jack sent one group to circle around, while he led the main force along the front path. The enemy at the station saw them coming and prepared to fight. The battle began at the gates of the station with loud clashes of steel. The fighters pressed forward step by step, holding the enemy in place until the second group closed in from behind. Caught between the two forces, the enemy tried to flee but found no escape. The fighters pushed them into the yard of the station and ended the fight. Quickly, Jack ordered the gates secured, and Claire sent word to the Queen that the water station was back in their hands. The river flowed freely again, and the city's supply was safe. As they returned to the city, the people came out to cheer them. The Queen stood on the steps of the tower to greet them. She praised their skill and bravery. Jack and Claire stood before her, but their minds were already on the battles to come. The enemy had been beaten again, but not broken. The next fight would decide the fate of the colony, and they both knew it. The days after the water station was secured were tense. The enemy did not strike again at once. Scouts reported strange movements beyond the hills. Large groups were gathering far from the city. As if waiting for the right moment, Jack met with Claire and the Queen in the tower. They agreed the enemy was preparing for one last attack. If they won this battle, the colony would be safe. If they lost, everything would fall. Claire spread her maps on the table. She showed the enemy camp in the northern valley. It was heavily guarded, but she had found a narrow pass through the rocks that led straight to the heart of the camp. Jack said they would strike before dawn, when the guards were tired and the enemy least expected it. The Queen gave her blessing and told them the city would stand ready to support them that night. The fighters prepared in silence. Jack walked among them, speaking few words. He looked each one in the eye and saw their resolve. Claire checked every route and marked every position on her map. When all was ready, they left the city, moving in the dark toward the northern valley. The path through the rocks was steep and narrow. The wind whistled through the stones, and the ground was uneven. But the fighters moved without complaint. Jack led from the front, and Claire followed close behind, guiding them along the safest steps. When they reached the top of the ridge, they could see the valley below. Fires burned in the enemy camp, and figures moved between the tents. Jack raised his hand, and the fighters spread out along the ridge. They waited for the signal, then with a swift motion, Jack led them down the slope. The first guards were taken before they could call out. The fighters swept into the camp, striking hard and fast. Claire directed them to the supply tents in the command center. The battle raged in the center of the camp. Jack faced the enemy leader in a fierce duel. The clash of steel rang through the air. Each strike was met with equal force, but Jack's skill and strength pushed his foe back step by step. At last, Jack saw his chance and ended the fight with a final blow. The enemy leader fell, and the rest began to break. Claire ordered the fighters to press the attack. They drove the enemy from the camp and set fire to the supply stores. The flames lit the valley, and smoke rose high into the night sky. The enemy scattered into the hills, leaving the camp to the Deathworlders. When the fight was over, Jack stood in the center of the camp, catching his breath. Ground was marked with the signs of battle, but the victory was clear. The fighters began to gather their wounded and collect what supplies could be saved. Claire came to stand beside Jack. She said the colony was safe now, and the enemy would not return. Soon, the march back to the city was slow, but filled with a sense of triumph. When they reached the gates, the people were waiting. The streets were lined with men, women, and children, cheering and calling their names. The Queen stood at the tower steps to greet them. She thanked Jack, Claire, and every fighter for answering the call from the shadows. She said the city would never forget what they had done that night. A great fire was lit in the main square. The people gathered to celebrate. The fighters stood among them, not as strangers but as heroes. Jack spoke to the crowd, saying they had fought, not only to save the city, but to show that no force could break the will of its people. Claire reminded them that courage and unity had won the battle more than any weapon. As the celebration went on, Jack looked to the stars. He knew the Deathworlders would not stay in the city forever. Sooner or later, another cry for help would come from some distant place. And when it did, they would answer again, stepping from the shadows to stand where they were needed most. For now, the city was safe. The fires of war had been put out, and the walls stood strong. The Queen ruled in peace, and the people worked to rebuild their homes. The fighters rested at last, but the spirit that had carried them through the darkest nights burned brighter than ever. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next chapter waited, ready to call them into the fight once more.